October 21st, 1917. Millfield, Pennsylvania. A town of 1,100 souls, nestled between rolling hills and the smoke-belching stacks of the Allegheny Iron Works. On this crisp autumn morning, as newspaper headlines screamed of battles raging across the Atlantic and mothers clutched telegrams with trembling hands, something far more unsettling was unfolding in the modest clapboard house at the end of Elm Street. 10-year-old Jamie Trenton sat at his mother's kitchen table, his pale blue eyes fixed on nothing, his small lips moving in whispers that would soon shatter the fragile peace of an already anxious community. The boy spoke secrets, not the innocent prattling of childhood, but truths so precise, so impossible for a child to know, that grown men would cross themselves and women would weep behind closed doors. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the postmaster's wife, would later testify that Jamie had approached her after Sunday service and whispered about her husband's gambling debts. Debts she herself had only discovered the night before, hidden beneath loose floorboards in their bedroom. Young Timothy Morrison, barely 16 and preparing to ship out to France, fled town after Jamie described in perfect detail the letter Timothy had written to his sweetheart, confessing to a crime he had committed 3 summers prior. A letter Timothy had burned and never sent. But it was not merely the living whose secrets Jamie revealed. The boy spoke of the dead with an intimacy that chilled witnesses to their bones. He would describe conversations that had occurred in private moments between spouses, one of whom had passed years before Jamie was born. He knew the final thoughts of men who had died in mining accidents, the hidden fears of women who had taken their own lives, the unspoken regrets that haunted the elderly in their final hours. How could a child, barely tall enough to reach the top shelf of his mother's pantry, possess knowledge that seemed to flow from some terrible, invisible source? How could a boy who had never left the confines of his small town not exist in this world? I have witnessed him describe the contents of sealed letters, the details of private conversations, the thoughts that plague men in the depths of their solitude. There is no earthly explanation for what this boy knows. The Trenton family had lived quietly in Millfield for 3 generations. William Trenton worked as a foreman at the ironworks, his calloused hands and honest demeanor earning him the respect of his peers. His wife, Margaret, tended their small garden and served on the church auxiliary. They were unremarkable people, living unremarkable lives, until their youngest child began to speak secrets that would transform their neighbors' understanding of what was possible in a rational world. As word of Jamie's abilities spread beyond the town limits, drawing visitors from as far as Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, the nature of his revelations began to change. No longer content with exposing hidden affairs or forgotten crimes, the boy began to speak of events that had not yet occurred. He would describe accidents with such precision that local authorities found themselves in the impossible position of trying to prevent tragedies based on the whispers of a 10-year-old child. The contradiction was maddening. Jamie appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary boy, with his freckled nose and gap-toothed smile, his love of marble games and penny candy. Yet, when the strange mood took him, when his eyes would glaze over and his voice would drop to that unsettling whisper, he became something else entirely, a conduit for knowledge that seemed to flow from a source beyond human comprehension. Reverend Arthur Blackwood, who had ministered to the people of Millfield for over 2 decades, struggled to reconcile his faith with the phenomenon he witnessed. "I have prayed for guidance," he confided to his bishop in a letter dated November 3, 1917. "I have searched the scriptures for explanation, yet I find myself faced with a child who speaks truths that pierce the veil between the known and unknown, between the living and the dead. If this is a gift from the Almighty, why does it feel so much like a curse?" The boy who spoke secrets no one should know would become, in the span of just a few months, the most feared and fascinating individual in a community already strained by war. Woodrow Wilson had declared war on Germany that spring, transforming a nation of farmers and factory workers into reluctant participants in humanity's first global conflict. In small towns like Millfield, the war existed as both distant thunder and immediate reality. Boys barely old enough to shave were boarding trains bound for training camps, while their mothers gathered in church basements to roll bandages and write letters to sons they might never see again. The cultural atmosphere of rural Pennsylvania in 1917 was a complex weaving of Christian faith, immigrant traditions, and the persistent shadows of older beliefs that had crossed the Atlantic in the hearts of settlers generations past. These communities existed in a peculiar space between the modern industrial world and the ancient superstitions that had once governed human understanding of the inexplicable. Telegraph wires carried news from distant battlefields, yet many families still placed iron horseshoes above their doorways and buried blessed salt at the corners of their properties. The Great War had awakened something restless in the American psyche. As casualty reports filtered back from the trenches of France, as young men disappeared into the maw of mechanized death, communities like Millfield found themselves grappling with questions that challenged the very foundations of their faith. If God was just and merciful, why did innocent boys die screaming in foreign mud? If prayer could move mountains, why did mothers' desperate pleas fail to bring their sons home whole? This spiritual uncertainty created fertile ground for the unusual, the unexplained, the impossible. Seances became commonplace in parlors where once only Bible readings had occurred. Grieving families sought comfort in mediums and fortune-tellers, desperate for any connection to loved ones lost to the European slaughter. The boundary between the rational and the mystical had grown thin, worn away by collective grief and the weight of too much sorrow. Into this atmosphere of heightened sensitivity to the supernatural came the Trenton family's peculiar burden. William Trenton's ancestors had arrived from the Yorkshire Dales in the 1760s, carrying with them weight of ancestral mysteries. The industrial landscape of Pennsylvania in 1917 provided a stark contrast to the ancient mysteries that seemed to flow through Jamie's young consciousness. The Allegheny Ironworks dominated Millfield's economy, its furnaces burning day and night to feed the war machine's insatiable appetite for steel. The rhythmic hammering of the forges created a mechanical heartbeat that pulsed through the town, while the smoke from countless chimneys painted the sky in shades of gray and amber. Yet beneath this veneer of modern progress, older patterns persisted. Immigrant families from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe had brought their own traditions of folk wisdom and supernatural belief. Mrs. Kowalski, who ran the boarding house on Main Street, hung wreaths of garlic and rowan berries around her doorframes. The Benedetto family crossed themselves whenever thunder rolled across the valley, murmuring prayers in dialects that predated the Roman Empire. The war had also brought a new awareness of mortality that permeated every aspect of daily life. Gold Star banners appeared in windows with increasing frequency, marking households where sons would never return. The local newspaper, the Millfield Gazette, published casualty lists that seemed to grow longer with each edition. Church services became exercises in communal grieving, as Reverend Blackwood struggled to find words of comfort for families whose faith had been shattered by loss. This atmosphere of death and uncertainty created a heightened sensitivity to any suggestion that the boundary between life and death might be more permeable than previously believed. When Jamie Trenton began speaking secrets that seemed to originate from beyond the grave, he was not dismissed as quickly as he might have been in more settled times. Instead, his words found an audience primed by grief and fear to accept that the impossible might, in fact, be possible. The technological limitations of 1917 also played a crucial role in Jamie's story. Without radio or reliable long-distance telephone service, news traveled slowly and often inaccurately through rural Pennsylvania. This meant that Jamie's predictions could unfold over days. Development and mental health in 1917 was rudimentary at best. Terms like schizophrenia and psychosis were largely unknown outside of major urban hospitals, and the idea that a child might suffer from complex psychological disorders was rarely considered. This meant that Jamie's behavior was interpreted through the lens of religious or supernatural explanation, rather than medical diagnosis. As autumn progressed toward winter in 1917, the people of Millfield found themselves caught between worlds, between the modern industrial reality of their daily lives and the ancient mysteries that seemed to speak through the lips of a 10-year-old boy, whose very existence challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of human knowledge and the boundaries of the possible. The first documented incident occurred on Sunday morning, September 30th, 1917, during the children's Bible study class held in the basement of Millfield Methodist Church. Miss Sarah Whitmore, who taught both the town's elementary school and served as Sunday school instructor, had gathered a dozen children around a worn wooden table to discuss the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jamie Trenton sat quietly among his peers, his small hands folded in his lap, his attention seemingly focused on the illustrated Bible story cards Miss Whitmore held up for the class to see. Mrs. Abigail Hutchinson, wife of the bank president and pillar of the church community, had arrived early to help arrange flowers for the morning service. She descended the basement stairs to retrieve additional vases from the storage closet, her footsteps echoing in the cool, stone-walled space. As she passed the children's table, Jamie looked up from his lesson and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, yet loud enough for both Mrs. Hutchinson and Miss Whitmore to hear clearly. "Your husband visits the widow Thompson on Tuesday afternoons when you think he's at the Rotary meetings," the boy said, his pale blue eyes fixed on Mrs. Hutchinson's shocked face. "He brings her flowers from your own garden and tells her about the money he's been moving from the church building fund." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Mrs. Hutchinson's face drained of color. Mrs. Hutchinson fled the basement without another word, her heeled shoes clattering against the stone steps as she rushed toward the sanctuary. Miss Whitmore dismissed the class early, sending the children upstairs with instructions to find their parents, while she remained alone with Jamie in the suddenly oppressive basement. "Jamie," she said gently, kneeling beside the boy's chair, "where did you hear those things about Mr. Hutchinson?" The child looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his 10 years. "I don't hear them, Miss Whitmore. They're just there. Like when you know you're hungry or when you know it's going to rain. I know Mrs. Hutchinson cries at night when she thinks about her baby that died before it was born. The one Mr. Hutchinson doesn't know about. I know she keeps the tiny shoes she knitted wrapped in tissue paper in her jewelry box." Miss Whitmore's hands began to shake. She had been present when Mrs. Hutchinson had suffered what the doctor had termed a female complaint 3 years prior, a miscarriage that had been kept private out of respect for the family's social position. No one outside of the immediate family and Dr. Marsh knew the true nature of Mrs. Hutchinson's illness. Certainly, no child would have access to such intimate knowledge. "How could you possibly know that, Jamie?" The boy shrugged with the casual indifference of childhood. "I know lots of things I'm not supposed to know. I know Mr. Peterson from the general store has another family in Pittsburgh that he visits once a month. I know Mrs. Sullivan talks to her dead husband every night before she goes to sleep, and sometimes she thinks she hears him answer back." Each revelation struck Miss Whitmore like a physical blow. She knew about Mr. Peterson's secret life because she had seen him boarding the train to Pittsburgh with suspicious frequency. She knew about Mrs. Sullivan's nocturnal conversations because she lived in the boarding house room adjacent to the widow's apartment and had often heard the soft murmur of one-sided conversations through the thin walls. But Jamie lived across town with his family. He had no access to such information, no opportunity to observe these private behaviors. Miss Whitmore found herself fielding questions from parents who wanted to know if the rumors were true. Had young Jamie Trenton really exposed the banker's crimes before they were discovered? Could a 10-year-old boy actually possess knowledge of such private, adult matters? Dr. Benjamin Marsh, who served as the unofficial arbiter of the town's more unusual occurrences, arranged to meet privately with the Trenton family that Friday evening. He found Jamie to be a perfectly normal child in most respects, curious, polite, occasionally mischievous in the way of all boys his age. But when the conversation turned to recent events, something in the child's demeanor shifted subtly. "It's not that I try to know things," Jamie explained to the concerned physician. "They just come to me like birds landing on a branch. Sometimes the knowing feels heavy, like when storm clouds gather before the rain. Other times it feels light, like secrets that want to be told." Dr. Marsh noted in his journal that evening, "The boy displays no signs of mental instability or delusional thinking. His manner is earnest and guileless. Yet he speaks of knowledge as if it were a living thing that chooses to inhabit his consciousness. Most disturbing of all, everything he has revealed has proven to be accurate to the smallest detail." As October arrived with its crisp mornings and golden afternoons, the people of Millfield began to regard Jamie Trenton with a mixture of fascination and fear. The boy who had shattered Mrs. Hutchinson's marriage with a whispered truth had opened a door that could never again be closed, revealing that the boundaries between known and unknown, between public face and private reality, were far more fragile than anyone had previously imagined. As October deepened into November of 1917, the incidents multiplied with disturbing frequency. Jamie's revelations evolved from isolated moments of impossible knowledge into a pattern of predictions that began to reshape the daily rhythms of Millfield. The boy seemed to carry within his slight frame an inexhaustible reservoir of secrets that touched every corner of the community. On November 5th, Jamie approached Thomas McBride, the head millwright at the iron, but the flames will catch his sleeve. He'll carry the scars for the rest of his life, but he won't die. Nobody dies in tomorrow's fire. The millwright felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November wind. You stay away from the mill, you hear me? There's no place for children in a man's workplace. But the following afternoon, at precisely 20 minutes past 2, the number 3 rolling mill's main bearing seized with a grinding shriek that could be heard 3 blocks away. Sparks flew in a brilliant cascade, igniting the oil reservoir exactly as Jamie had predicted. Stefan Kowalski, attempting to beat down the flames with his heavy work coat, suffered severe burns to his left arm that would indeed scar him for life. The fire was contained within 10 minutes, and no lives were lost. Word of Jamie's prediction reached Dr. Marsh within hours. The physician found himself in the unprecedented position of trying to document phenomena that challenged every principle of rational thought he had been taught to embrace. His medical training told him that precognition was impossible. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate with terrifying consistency. Margaret Trenton's private diary, discovered years later during an estate sale, revealed the growing anguish of a mother watching her child slip away into something she could neither understand nor control. Her entry, dated November 8, 1917, read, "Jamie woke me at 3 this morning, standing beside my bed in his nightgown, like a little specter. His eyes were wide and strange, and when he spoke, his voice carried an echo I have never heard before. Mrs. Patterson's baby isn't going to live through the winter," he whispered. "The fever will take him when the snow comes heavy." I tried to comfort him, to tell him it was just a nightmare, but he shook his head with such certainty. "It's not a dream, Mama. It's just what is." When I tucked him back into bed, his skin felt cold as marble, though the house was warm. 3 weeks later, little Edmund Patterson, barely 8 months old and the joy of his parents' lives, developed a respiratory fever that resisted. "Henley is screaming." I scolded him for the inappropriate interruption and continued with the multiplication tables. 20 minutes later, young Billy Henley burst into the classroom to report that his grandfather had indeed fallen down the stairs at home and was being carried to Dr. Marsh's office. The boy's timing was precise to the minute. The nights became particularly difficult for the Trenton household. Margaret's diary entries grew increasingly desperate as she described her son's nocturnal wanderings. "Jamie walks the house after midnight, moving from room to room like a restless spirit. I find him standing at windows, staring into the darkness and whispering names of people I do not recognize. Sometimes he speaks in what sounds like different voices, deeper tones that seem to come from somewhere other than his small throat. When I ask him about these midnight journeys, he says he is keeping watch for the stories that come in the dark." Dr. Marsh, growing increasingly concerned about the boy's psychological state, arranged for a consultation with Dr. Harold Whitman, a neurologist from Pittsburgh Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. Whitman's examination, conducted on November 22nd, revealed no physical abnormalities. Jamie's reflexes were normal, his motor functions appropriate for his age, his cognitive development typical of an intelligent 10-year-old boy. However, Dr. Whitman's private notes, preserved in the hospital's archives, captured his bewilderment. The subject presents as a healthy, articulate child with no obvious signs of mental disturbance or neurological dysfunction. Yet during our interview, He demonstrated knowledge of my own private circumstances that no child could possibly possess. He knew about my wife's recent miscarriage, information that has been shared with no one outside our immediate family. He described the contents of a letter I received from my brother in France, including details about trench conditions that have been censored from all published accounts. Most disturbing, he predicted that I would receive news of my brother's death within the week. I pray the boy is wrong, but his accuracy thus far has been absolute. Dr. Whitman received the telegram announcing his brother's death, and the wind howled through the bare branches of oak and maple trees. The boy's revelations took on an increasingly ominous character that began to affect the entire community's sense of stability and safety. The first major escalation occurred during Sunday service on December 9th, when Reverend Arthur Blackwood was delivering his sermon on the theme of divine mysteries. Jamie, sitting with his family in their customary pew halfway down the left side of the sanctuary, suddenly stood up in the middle of the Reverend's discourse about faith in times of uncertainty. "Reverend Blackwood," the boy said in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the church, "you need to tell everyone about the letter you received from your brother in Philadelphia, the one about the influenza that's coming." The congregation turned as one to stare at the child, their faces reflecting confusion and growing unease. Reverend Blackwood's complexion paled visibly as he gripped the edges of his pulpit. "The sickness is going to reach Millfield in February," Jamie continued, his young voice taking on that familiar, unsettling quality that had become so recognizable to those who knew him. "Mrs. Henderson will be the first to die, then her youngest daughter. The school will close for 6 weeks. 23 people in town won't live to see spring." Margaret Trenton rose hastily from her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment and fear, and attempted to escort her son from the sanctuary. But Jamie shook his head and remained standing. "I'm sorry, Mama, but they need to know. Dr. Marsh should start preparing now. He's going to need more medicine than he thinks." The service ended in chaos, with congregation members demanding explanations from Reverend Blackwood about the letter Jamie had mentioned. The Reverend, shaken by the boy's impossible knowledge of private correspondence, eventually admitted that he had indeed received a confidential communication from his physician brother, warning of a particularly virulent strain of influenza that was spreading through the eastern cities. Within days, religious leaders from neighboring towns arrived in Millfield to investigate what they termed the Trenton phenomenon room. Most troubling of all, he accurately described the contents of sealed letters in my possession, including one that contained information about my own father's death, information that had been withheld from all public knowledge. The attempted exorcism that followed was a disaster that would haunt the participants for years to come. Reverend Thornfield, assisted by Reverend Blackwood and Father Giuseppe Alberti from the Catholic Church in the county seat, gathered in the Trenton home on the evening of December 15th. Their intention was to determine whether Jamie was possessed by malevolent spirits, and if so, to perform the necessary rituals for his spiritual cleansing. The ceremony began at 8 o'clock in the evening, with the family and clergy assembled in the parlor, while snow fell heavily outside the frost-covered windows. Jamie sat calmly in a straight-backed chair, his hands folded in his lap, his expression one of patient curiosity rather than fear or distress. As Reverend Thornfield began the opening prayers, Jamie's demeanor shifted subtly. His eyes took on that distant quality that had become so familiar. And when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that seemed to fill the room with oppressive weight. "Reverend Thornfield," the boy said, "you should tell them about what you did to your sister when you were 14 years old, about why she really left home and never came back." The Reverend's prayer faltered as color drained from his face. Jamie continued speaking, his young voice describing intimate details of a family scandal that had been buried for over 30 years. "Father Alberti," Jamie turned his attention to the Catholic priest, "the money from the poor box that you've been taking to pay your gambling debts, your bishop is going to find out next month. You're going to be defrocked and sent away in disgrace." The exorcism collapsed into chaos as each member of the clergy found their most carefully guarded secrets exposed with surgical precision. Rather than casting out demons from the boy, the ritual had somehow unleashed his abilities to an unprecedented degree. By the evening's end, all three religious leaders had fled the Trenton home, their faith in their own spiritual authority shattered by examination. Conducted over 3 days between Christmas and New Year's, produced results that challenged every theoretical framework he had developed during his distinguished career. The subject demonstrates no signs of mental illness, neurological dysfunction, or psychological abnormality, Dr. Weissman wrote in his confidential report to the medical board. Yet he possesses knowledge that defies rational explanation. During our sessions, he accurately described the details of my private research into shell shock among returning veterans, including specific case studies that have never been published. He knew about my correspondence with colleagues in Vienna, about family matters that I have shared with no one, about professional decisions I have not yet made public. If this is fraud, it is the most sophisticated deception I have ever encountered. If it is genuine, then we must reconsider everything we believe we understand about the nature of human consciousness and the boundaries of possible knowledge. As 1917 drew to a close, the people of Millfield found themselves living in the shadow of a child whose very existence challenged the foundations of their understanding of reality itself. The events that would forever mark January 1918 as the darkest month in Millfield's history began on New Year's Day, when Jamie Trenton walked into the office of the Millfield Gazette and asked to speak with editor Harold Brennan. The boy carried with him a piece of paper covered in his careful, childish handwriting, containing a list of names that would soon transform local curiosity into national crisis. "These are the men from Millfield who are going to die in France," Jamie told the startled editor, placing the paper on Brennan's desk. "Their families will get the telegrams between January 8th and January 15th. I thought you should know so you could prepare the obituaries." The list contained 17 names, including Thomas Morrison, who had just turned 18 and been deployed to the Argonne Forest, and Michael O'Brien, whose wife had given birth to their first child just weeks before his departure. Each name was accompanied by specific details about how and when death would find them, information that a 10-year-old boy in rural Pennsylvania could not possibly possess. Brennan stared at the list with growing horror. "Jamie, where did you get these names? How could you know such things?" The boy casualties. The 17th, Private Robert Hayes, would survive his wounds but lose both legs to gangrene, making Jamie's notation of not death but something worse chillingly prophetic. Word of Jamie's impossible accuracy reached federal authorities with alarming speed. On January 20th, 2 men in dark suits arrived in Millfield, identifying themselves as agents of the Bureau of Investigation. They came seeking answers to questions that had begun to concern the highest levels of government. How could a child predict military casualties with such precision? Was this some form of enemy espionage? Did the boy represent a threat to national security? Special Agent Robert Crawford conducted his initial interview with Jamie in the presence of the boy's parents and Dr. Marsh. The agent's report, classified for over 60 years before being discovered in federal archives, painted a portrait of an encounter that left seasoned investigators questioning their own sanity. The subject demonstrated knowledge of classified military operations that should be known only to senior commanders in the European theater, Agent Crawford wrote. He described troop movements that had not been reported through official channels, predicted the outcomes of battles that had not yet been fought, and provided details about enemy positions that our own intelligence services had been unable to confirm. When questioned about the source of his information, the subject stated simply that the dying soldiers tell me things because they want someone to remember them. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Jamie led the agents to the basement of his family's home and pointed to a section of the stone foundation where the mortar appeared newer than the surrounding masonry. Behind the loose stones, investigators discovered a collection of artifacts that would redefine their understanding of the case. Journals written in languages that predated modern European dialects, carved wooden symbols that bore disturbing resemblances to occult markings, and most shocking of all, detailed drawings of military uniforms and battlefield scenes that matched contemporary photographs from the European front with uncanny accuracy. The drawings appear to have been created by multiple hands over a span of many years. During each full moon, where family members would gather in the basement to listen for the voices of those who speak from beyond the veil of time. She admitted that Jamie had been present at these gatherings since his earliest childhood, though she claimed the family had no understanding of what forces they might be invoking. "We thought we were simply honoring our ancestors," she told the investigators, her voice breaking with emotion. "My grandmother taught me the words, just as her grandmother had taught her. We never imagined that Jamie would become what he has become." The most disturbing discovery came when agents examined Jamie's bedroom and found the walls covered with symbols carved directly into the plaster, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when observed peripherally. The boy had apparently been creating these markings for months, working in the dark hours of early morning when the rest of the household slept. Dr. Edgar Whitmore, a specialist in ancient languages, brought in from the Smithsonian Institution, identified the symbols as variations of pre-Christian Celtic Ogham script, modified with elements that appeared to be original to Jamie's unconscious mind. The boy has somehow recreated writing systems that died out over 1,000 years ago, Dr. Whitmore reported. Yet he has never been exposed to Celtic historical texts or archaeological materials. The symbols appear to be a form of automatic writing, created without conscious knowledge of their meaning or origin. On February 2, 1918, Jamie experienced what Dr. Marsh would later describe as a complete psychological collapse. The boy was found by his mother at dawn, standing in the basement among the family artifacts, his eyes wide and unseeing, his body trembling with an intensity that shook the entire room. When Margaret touched her son's shoulder, he spoke in a voice that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. "The great dying is coming," he said, the words echoing strangely in the confined space. "Not just the war dying, but the sickness dying. Millions will fall before the year ends. The influenza will spread like fire across the world, and I will see every face, know every name, feel every final breath. hoped to understand and potentially harness his extraordinary abilities for intelligence purposes. The last documented sighting of Jamie in Millfield occurred the night before his removal, when several townspeople reported seeing a small figure standing in the cemetery, moving between the graves and whispering to the headstones. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who lived adjacent to the burial ground, later testified that she heard the boy speaking in languages she did not recognize, his voice carrying clearly through the cold February air. He was saying goodbye, she told investigators, not just to our dead, but to all the dead, everywhere, as if he could see them all at once, and they were all his friends. The Trenton house was sealed by federal order on February 11th, its contents classified as evidence in an ongoing investigation. The basement where Jamie had conducted his mysterious vigils was filled with concrete, and the building itself was eventually demolished under the supervision of government agents who seemed determined to erase all physical traces of the boy's extraordinary gift. But the questions raised by Jamie Trenton's brief presence in Millfield would persist long after his removal, challenging every assumption about the nature of human consciousness, the boundaries of possible knowledge, and the invisible forces that might shape our understanding of past, present, and future. The morning of February 11th, 1918, dawned gray and bitter cold as a black government automobile disappeared down the main road leading out of Millfield, carrying with it the boy whose impossible knowledge had transformed a quiet Pennsylvania town into the center of one of the most perplexing mysteries in American history. In the days that followed Jamie Trenton's removal, the community struggled to comprehend what had occurred within their midst and what his absence might mean for their future. The Trenton family's fate became the subject of hushed speculation and growing concern. William Trenton continued to report for his shifts at the ironworks for exactly 1 week following his son's departure, his face bearing the hollow expression of a man who had lost something beyond recovery. Margaret was seen only once, remaining furniture and personal effects, before sealing the windows and doors with boards that bore official warnings against trespass. The house stood empty for less than a month before demolition crews arrived to raze the structure entirely, leaving only a vacant lot where the Trentons had once lived their quiet, unremarkable lives. But Jamie's absence did not bring peace to Millfield. Instead, it marked the beginning of phenomena that would plague the community for years to come. Residents reported hearing a child's voice whispering from empty buildings, particularly during the dark hours before dawn. The whispers spoke names of townspeople and described events that had not yet occurred, continuing Jamie's pattern of impossible knowledge even in his physical absence. Mrs. Patterson, still grieving the loss of her infant son, whom Jamie had predicted would not survive the winter, claimed that she frequently heard the boy's voice speaking to her through the heating registers in her home. "He tells me things about Edmund," she confided to Dr. Marsh during one of her increasingly frequent visits to his office. "Things about what my baby is doing now, where he has gone. Jamie says Edmund is safe and happy, but that he watches over me and knows when I cry." The influenza pandemic that Jamie had predicted struck Millfield in early March, following the exact timeline and claiming the precise number of victims the boy had foretold months earlier. Mrs. Henderson died on March 8th, followed by her youngest daughter 3 days later. The school closed for 6 weeks, and 23 residents of the town succumbed to the disease before the outbreak ran its course. Dr. Marsh found himself in the unprecedented position of treating patients based on prophetic information provided by a child who was no longer present. Jamie's detailed predictions about the progression of the pandemic proved so accurate that the physician was able to prepare medications and arrange for additional medical supplies weeks before they would normally be needed. Yet the knowledge came with a terrible psychological cost, as Dr. Marsh struggled with the foreknowledge of which patients he would be unable to save. Reports began to filter in from neighboring communities, describing encounters with an explanation. Church attendance dwindled throughout the spring and summer of 1918, as residents struggled to reconcile their beliefs with the impossible realities they had observed. The federal investigation into Jamie's abilities continued in secret, with periodic visits from government agents who questioned residents about any unusual occurrences or ongoing manifestations of the boy's influence. These interviews were conducted with an intensity that suggested the authorities remained deeply concerned about the implications of Jamie's case for national security and scientific understanding. Miss Sarah Whitmore left her position at the Millfield School in June of 1918, citing health concerns that she never fully explained to her colleagues. Her departure came shortly after she reported finding her classroom filled with children's voices, reciting lessons in languages she did not recognize, despite the building being empty and locked for the summer vacation. The cemetery where Jamie had been seen on his final night in Millfield became a site of particular unease for the community. Groundskeeper Thomas Mitchell reported that grave markers frequently appeared to have been disturbed, not by vandals or animals, but as if someone had been kneeling beside them in prayer or contemplation. Fresh flowers appeared on graves of people who had no living relatives, and visitors reported hearing whispered conversations among the headstones during evening hours. By autumn of 1918, a pattern had emerged that would define Millfield's relationship with its mysterious past for generations to come. The town had become a destination for researchers, journalists, and curiosity seekers, drawn by stories of the boy who had spoken secrets no one should know. Yet these visitors invariably left with more questions than answers, carrying with them tales of unexplained phenomena that seemed to multiply rather than diminish with Jamie's absence. The Millfield Gazette ceased publication in December of 1918, after editor Harold Brennan suffered what he described as a complete nervous collapse. His final editorial, published on Christmas Eve, consisted of only a single sentence: "Some truths are too heavy for the human heart to bear, and some knowledge comes with a price that no community should be asked to pay." The boy, 17 and 18, was Jamie Trenton, a gifted child whose abilities science had not yet learned to explain? Or was he something else entirely, a conduit for forces that humanity was never meant to understand? The official records of the federal investigation remain classified to this day, buried in archives that most researchers believe will never be opened to public scrutiny. What fragments of documentation have emerged through various channels paint a picture of a government deeply unsettled by implications that extended far beyond a single unusual child. Internal memoranda hint at ongoing research into what officials termed temporal intelligence capabilities and non-conventional information-gathering assets. Dr. Benjamin Marsh, who had served as the closest thing to a scientific observer during Jamie's time in Millfield, spent the remainder of his medical career attempting to understand what he had witnessed. His private papers, donated to the Pennsylvania Historical Society upon his death in 1942, reveal a man haunted by questions that traditional medicine could not address. "I have practiced the healing arts for over 30 years, Dr. Marsh wrote in his final journal entry. "I have seen the human body triumph over impossible odds and succumb to mysterious failures. Yet nothing in my experience prepared me for Jamie Trenton." The boy possessed knowledge that seemed to flow from a source beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness. If consciousness itself is far more expansive than we have imagined, if the mind can somehow access information that exists outside the normal constraints of time and space, then everything we believe about human potential must be reconsidered. The question of heredity, whether Jamie's abilities represented some form of genetic anomaly passed down through generations of his family, remains one of the most intriguing aspects of the case. The artifacts discovered in the Trenton basement suggested a lineage of individuals who had served as what their own records called witnesses to the unfolding of necessary sorrows. This phrase implies a purpose beyond random psychic phenomena, suggesting that Jamie's knowledge served some larger function in the cosmic order of events. Religious interpretations of Jamie's abilities varied widely, reflecting the deep divisions within the spiritual community about the nature of divine revelation. Emerging fields of psychology and neurology offered no frameworks for understanding how a child could possess information that seemed to originate from sources beyond his immediate experience. Modern neuroscience, with its sophisticated understanding of brain function and consciousness, might offer different perspectives, yet the essential mystery would likely remain unsolved. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Jamie's story lies not in the supernatural nature of his abilities, but in their implications for human privacy and the security of our inner lives. If knowledge can exist independently of experience, if secrets can be accessed by consciousness operating outside normal boundaries, then the fundamental assumption that our thoughts and private actions remain hidden becomes questionable. Jamie's revelations exposed not just individual secrets, but the fragility of the barriers we construct between our public and private selves. The accuracy of his predictions about the influenza pandemic and military casualties raises questions about the nature of fate and free will that philosophers have debated for centuries. If future events can be known with certainty, do we possess any genuine agency in shaping our destinies, or are we simply actors following a script that has already been written, with individuals like Jamie serving as unwitting readers of that cosmic screenplay? The geographical spread of Jamie's sightings after his removal from Millfield suggests that his abilities may have been enhanced rather than diminished by government intervention. If the reports are accurate, the boy continued to appear at moments of crisis and tragedy throughout the eastern United States, always serving as a harbinger of events that would soon unfold with devastating accuracy. This pattern implies that whatever forces operated through Jamie were not constrained by the normal limitations of physical existence. The psychological cost of possessing such knowledge, bearing witness to tragedy before it occurs, knowing secrets that cause pain when revealed, may explain why Jamie's gifts seem to manifest with increasing intensity over time. The weight of impossible knowledge may have been more than any child's consciousness could bear, leading to the collapse that preceded his removal from normal society. In our modern era, when technology has made privacy increasing, Trenton may not be how such abilities are possible, but why they emerge when they do and what purpose they might serve. If consciousness can occasionally breach the normal constraints of time and individual experience, if knowledge can sometimes flow from sources beyond conventional understanding, then perhaps such phenomena represent evolutionary adaptations to circumstances that require expanded awareness. The boy who spoke secrets no one should know left behind no simple answers, only a legacy of profound questions about the nature of human consciousness and the hidden connections that link past, present, and future. His story serves as a reminder that reality may be far more complex and mysterious than our everyday experience suggests, and that the boundaries between known and unknown, between possible and impossible, remain as fragile as the whispered truths that once emerged from the lips of a 10-year-old child in a small Pennsylvania town, forever changing our understanding of what it means to know.